Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. When was the last time you successfully built a new habit? A morning routine, a bit of exercise, drinking more water, and felt genuinely proud of yourself for it? Now here's the harder question. How many habits do you have right now that you wish you could stop and just can't? The late night scrolling, the stress eating, the way your phone is in your hand before you've even consciously decided to pick it up. Most of us have tried to break at least one of these. Most of us have failed, more than once. And we tend to blame ourselves for that. Lack of discipline, lack of willpower, lack of commitment. But what if the problem isn't you at all? What if breaking a habit is simply a fundamentally different challenge to building one, and nobody told you that? Think back to learning to drive. The first few lessons were exhausting, right? Every small action required conscious effort. Mirrors, clutch, indicator, speed. Your brain was working flat out just to keep the car on the road. Now, if you've been driving for a few years, you probably navigate familiar routes while your mind is somewhere else entirely. You arrive at your destination and barely remember the journey. That's not carelessness. That's your brain doing exactly what it's designed to do, taking a repeated behavior and automating it, so your conscious mind is freed up for other things. Neuroscientists have traced this process in detail. When you're learning something new, the prefrontal cortex, the front part of your brain, the part responsible for conscious decision-making, is highly active. But as you repeat the behavior in the same context, control gradually shifts to a much older, deeper structure called the basal ganglia. The habit gets filed away as a reliable, efficient routine. Your brain no longer needs to think about it. And this is where it gets important. Building a new habit works. With this system, you repeat a behavior, attach a reward, and over time the basal ganglia takes over and it becomes automatic. Straightforward enough. Breaking an existing habit is something else entirely. Because that neural pathway, the one connecting the cue to the routine, doesn't disappear just because you've decided you don't want it anymore. It lies dormant in the basal ganglia, waiting. The moment the right trigger appears, it fires. This is why willpower fails so consistently. You think you're making a choice, but your brain has already filed that behavior away as automatic. You're not fighting a decision. You're fighting a reflex. Every habit follows the same basic loop. A cue triggers a routine, and a reward reinforces it. Most advice about breaking habits focuses on the routine, the behavior itself. Just stop doing it. Just resist. Just be stronger. But the routine is actually the easiest part of the loop to address. The cue is where the real problem lives. Think about the last time you tried to quit something. You probably managed for a few days, maybe even longer. And then one evening, the cue appeared. You sat down on the sofa after dinner. You walked through the kitchen. Your phone screen lit up. And the old routine followed almost before you'd registered it was happening. That's the basal ganglia doing its job. It detected a familiar signal and executed the associated routine, efficiently, automatically, without waiting for your permission. So the single most effective thing you can do to break a habit isn't to fight the routine with resolve. It's to make the cue disappear. Researchers call this context disruption. And there's a striking piece of evidence for how well it works. Studies have found that people are far more likely to successfully break unwanted habits during major life transitions, moving to a new home, starting a new job, traveling somewhere unfamiliar. Not because they suddenly found more willpower, but because the environmental cues that triggered the old habit simply weren't there anymore. The basal ganglia goes looking for its signal and comes up empty. You don't have to wait for a major life change to use this. You can create that disruption deliberately right now. So what does that look like practically? The first step is to actually identify the real cue, and it's often not what you think. Before you try to change anything, spend a few days observing. Notice what's happening just before the habit kicks in. Not just the obvious situation, but your emotional state. The time of day. What you were doing 5 minutes before. whether you were alone or with other people. Very often, the true trigger turns out to be something unexpected. Boredom disguised as hunger. Low-level anxiety that expresses itself as the urge to check social media. Once you know what you're actually responding to, you can start to work with it instead of against it. The second step is to change the environment, not just the intention. The sofa, the kitchen counter, the phone on the bedside table, these aren't neutral objects. They've become cues. Moving them, removing them, or changing the context around them severs the association. Charging your phone in a different room doesn't sound like a big deal, but it removes the cue entirely. And without the cue, the automatic routine has nothing to latch onto. Third, and this one is important, don't just remove a habit. Replace it. A habit is partly a need-seeking mechanism. The cue is the brain signaling that it wants something: relief, stimulation, comfort, a break. If you simply remove the response without addressing that underlying need, the signal keeps coming. The craving persists. Eventually, something gives. Far more effective is to keep the cue, keep the reward, and swap out the routine for something that genuinely satisfies the same need. If stress is the cue and mental relief is the reward, give yourself that relief through a short walk, a few slow breaths, a moment away from your screen. Something real. The goal is to redirect the pathway, not to dam it up and hope the pressure doesn't build. And finally, introduce friction. Make the habit slightly harder to perform. Log out of the app. Put the food at the back of the cupboard. Move the thing you always reach for just far enough away that reaching for it requires a conscious decision. This sounds almost insultingly simple, but it works because automatic behavior is lazy. It follows the path of least resistance. A small amount of friction is often enough to interrupt the automaticity and give your conscious mind a chance to catch up. One last thing, and maybe the most important. Breaking a habit rarely looks like a smooth upward line. There will be slips, especially when you're tired or stressed or out of your normal environment, exactly the conditions where the brain defaults to its most deeply worn pathways. That's not a character flaw. It's neurologically predictable. The old pathway is still there. Stress reactivates it. What determines whether you succeed long-term isn't whether you slip. It's how quickly you return to your intended behavior without turning the slip into a story about who you are. One bad evening doesn't undo the work. But deciding that one bad evening proves you'll never change, that does. The goal here isn't perfection. It's gradually weakening one pathway while quietly building another until the scales tip in your favor. Good habits are worth building. But if there's an unwanted habit running quietly in the background, overriding your best intentions day after day, that's the place to start. Understand how it got wired in. Change the context around it. Give yourself a genuine alternative. The habit was learned, which means it can be unlearned. If you found the video interesting, we'd really appreciate a thumbs up, and for more insights, don't forget to subscribe.